This program is brought to you by Emory University.
So you may have seen that when we had a meeting this afternoon with Harry Lennix, all the prayer flags were still up, and when we came out of the meeting, they were gone. So we have now moved on from Tibet Week. Social Justice Week is just finishing at Emory, and so this fits in nicely with that. I'm Sheila Kavanagh. I'm the co-director of Emory's Year of Shakespeare. I hope that you've been able to participate in some of the activities that we have had. And since I first concocted this crazy idea of doing a year of Shakespeare, two of the things that were most important to me is that since we are in Atlanta, I wanted to highlight the African American arts tradition. And I also wanted to highlight all of the important social justice work that is going on currently in the Shakespeare world. And so a number of our events have focused on one or other of those aspects. This conversation is one that I have envisioned for a very long time, and I'm absolutely ecstatic that it has actually come to pass. And I'm thrilled to welcome you here this evening. Many of you in the Emory community know Dr. Reverend Dwight Andrews, who is on the music faculty here. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Michigan and then did an MDiv and a PhD at Yale. While he was at Yale, he was the music director for August Wilson's plays on Broadway. He's done a number of film music. He's done a lot with jazz, including a class that I actually took at one point, and did his dissertation on classical music. Unlike mere mortals who find one full-time job enough to fill their lives, Dwight has two full-time jobs. He is faculty here at Emory, and he is senior minister at First Congregational Church in downtown Atlanta, a position that he shared for quite some time with Ambassador Andy Young. And I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you here tonight. Equally thrilled to welcome Harry Lennix, who many of you may know from his film or his television work. He is currently on the blacklist. In the world of Shakespeare, we'll talk some about Shakespeare, but not exclusively about Shakespeare tonight. He played Titus in Julie Taymor's film of The Tempest. He has been in Alita Chappelle's Romeo and Juliet in Harlem. He has, you will see a clip from his H4 film, so he can tell you about that. Batman v Superman, I think, has a different social justice aspect, but certainly I think it would be hard for us to argue that that doesn't count as social justice.
Justice League, Justice League.
Justice League, exactly. What many people don't know is that he started out as a seminary student, planning to be a Catholic priest, hoping to be the Pope. I told him earlier today that now that Pope Francis has opened things up to married men, that perhaps the goal of being Pope could still be open to him. And tonight, what we're going to be talking about are the way, with both of these men, like this semester, Dwight is teaching a class on spirituality and jazz. Both of them, Harry, you can go on YouTube, and he's got some of his MLK sermons are there. The other thing, you can go on YouTube. Harry went to college with everybody famous you've ever heard of, including Stephen Colbert.
Oh,
so
wow.
if you go on the web and type in Harry Lennix and Stephen Colbert does a dead-on Harry Lennix impersonation.
Amazing.
But his work, both of them have work that links together the spiritual realm, the artistic realm, and the social justice realm, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So I'm thrilled to have you here. I'm beyond thrilled to have both of you here, and I welcome you both.
Thank you.
And I don't know in which order, if you'd like to talk a little bit about your work and how you see the things fit together.
Well, I'd love to start with Harry in some ways, because even though we work together in theater, There's a whole world of Harry Lennix that I'm just coming to appreciate, more fully. And you've had a fascinating spiritual journey, and I'd love for you to maybe introduce us to a little bit of some of it as a way to begin, because I think it really is the right place to talk about how the nexus between art and spirituality and social justice. I think he's a great example. So tell us a little bit that we don't know.
Yep. Sir. All right. Well, I am thrilled to be sharing the stage with my dear friend Dwight, of course, and you, Sheila, who I've known now for several years.
Yeah.
Several years. We met at a symposium on Shakespeare at Rhodes College. But in any case, so thank you, and thank you for hosting us tonight. But I started off, my niece, by the way, is here. She may know a little bit of this. This is my niece, Rosa. She grew up with me in the household. I was out of the seminary by that point. But when I was a young man, the church was just about everything. My mother worked in a rectory for a priest. She was a laundress. Two different rectories, actually. And so she, through the dint of her labor, sent us all to Catholic school. With my father, as I said, died before I was 2. She never took a dime from the government. But she was just a hard-working woman, sort of salt of the earth woman, who died on Christmas night this past year. Perfect 360. She wrapped up her life as a present to us and gave it to us on Christmas night, where we realized what that was. But from the time I was conscious of a God, I always knew that the most important question was, who is God and what does God want from me? And I just remember walking into the Catholic Church when I was a boy, taking my orders, the sacraments. I don't remember being baptized, but I certainly remember First Confession, and I certainly remember the incense and the sort of total sensory experience of what Catholicism was at that point. We were fairly inundated with churches in that neighborhood. We were fairly inundated with talk of God. It was far more ubiquitous then than it is now. And so I was telling Reverend Andrews a little bit earlier that I never was an atheist, but I've dabbled with agnosticism. I have been a Muslim. I have been a Buddhist for about 3 weeks. But I keep coming back. Something keeps coming back, brings me back to Christianity. And I think it's in the method and the ministry of Christ, his lack of judgment on people, except for hypocrites, his enjoyment of having a good time. We were talking about the Gospel of John earlier and what is unique to it. One of the things that is unique to John is the wedding at Cana, where he turns water into wine. And the fact that there's this essentially an ascetic, religious guy. Some people differ on exactly who he was and what he believed and if he even existed. But whoever he was a guy who understood that life was a comprehensive experience, and you could not deny the flesh completely, and he engaged with those things. And so, as somebody who has made a life as a practitioner of the arts to a certain degree, having to find a way to be true to my beliefs and to still be a practicing professional has led, I think, almost inevitably to where I am now, which is this intersection of faith and commerce, frankly. Show business is the biggest part of show business is business. And so you have to be financially viable if you're going to have any kind of career in this. But where does faith fit into that? And so in the pursuit of trying to find an answer, not just by myself, but I have a colleague whose name is Dr. Holly Carter, who is a theologian, and she has this idea which she calls marketplace ministry, that is merging the film industry or the entertainment industry with faith. Ministry without walls, she also calls it. But I've come to describe it in my own terms. I'm deeply fascinated with theology and philosophy. But recently I've come upon this term which is called theological aesthetics. That is, that the concerns of the artists in general are no less rigorous for a Christian artist or a Muslim artist, somebody trying to represent faith through art. But the balance, the composition, the color scheme, the truth, the beauty, all of those things are equally vital to, if it's going to be practiced at a certain level, to a person of belief. And so I think that there's a great opportunity to develop here, and we're going to be sharing some clips with you as we go on in this discussion. But it occurs to me, and this is something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, Dwight, Sheila, that in black art, such as it is, and I use the term black to mean a specific experience here in the United States of America. I do not regard people of African descent or whatever who don't have any engagement with the slave experience as black. That's a different experience. You could be an African American and be white, for example, but you cannot be black and be white. You know, so to at least under a certain definition. So in any case, no one is engaged in this field of endeavor who is black in America. You can go to the movies today and see as many slaves as you have the stomach for, but you cannot go and see God as a black man, unless it's a comedy, you know, with Jim Carrey or something, and it's sort of understood to be not representative of the actual case. And so I think that this is bringing water to the desert. So to that end, I think that knowing how deeply religious black people are and how deeply fascinated many people, just about every other culture, is with black Christian faith, music, art, culture. We were talking about Baraka a little bit earlier and his ideas about culture and how it is specific to this experience. Nobody black is doing black religious work as entertainment. And I think I think it's extraordinarily important. I don't know why it hasn't been done, but that is going to be the next phase of my life, and I intend to pursue it as diligently as anything I've ever done. Not as an actor, necessarily, but as a producer and as a purveyor, a impresario of these kinds of entertainments, because I think that they're desperately, desperately needed in this time of social unrest and great national anxiety, to some extent international anxiety. People need a beacon, and the role that black people have played in the entire history of the United States as such has been a kind of spiritual bellwether. We are the litmus test for how faith, true authentic Christianity, true love, true filial devotion, and all this, how you treat the black people in America has always been, but now we are at a point where we have abandoned much of that high ground, where we have sold it down the river for a fistful of magic beans and some wishful thinking and some cultural authenticity, which has nothing to do with the black experience, where the black experience is almost entirely unrecognizable for somebody in my mother's generation or my own generation. I don't know those people. They can't even fight with their fists. They can't, they can't even express themselves without being vulgar. Many of these people who were given the title of being down by law or true to the game or keeping it real or 100%. This is not 100%. These are affectations that we have gobbled up because we've made a buck from them. And so if for no other reason than to try to lead the people, all people, but certainly my people, who need it more than anyone and who need it now more than ever, to the promised land. And I think that is with a re-engagement with our spirituality and by going back to those tenets that have brought us this far. Thank you.
Harry Lennix has my vote. So you better run for something right away. But I will vote and be your campaign manager.
I'm going to run for the hills. Keep taking you out of these.
Well, this is wonderful for a lot of different reasons, but the great irony of this moment is that Harry and I worked, I think, last at the Kennedy Center for a retrospective of August Wilson's plays, and we never had this conversation.
No, we didn't.
We rehearsed, we worked, and we never had this conversation. And so in some ways I felt like we missed an opportunity that God has finally brought us to this conversation this very day. So I am very grateful because, as you can already hear, there's a depth of thought behind this artist that comes out in the work that he's doing and will continue to do, that I've always thought that's what artists are supposed to do. They're supposed to think and act and express and be true. My story is quite different from Harry's in terms of my spiritual arc. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and had a rock and roll band, and wanted to go and be a part of the Motown scene in Detroit. And so we rehearsed every Saturday in the church basement because we were so loud that we couldn't rehearse in our own homes anymore. So one of the guys in the band, his dad was a minister, and so he happily let us practice in the church basement. And practicing in the church basement, I saw this small church in middle of Detroit being very active in kind of grassroots community organizing. And it finally dawned on me as a teenager that churches don't just have worship, they actually change people's lives and work with people to make their lives better. And so my whole spiritual journey began with not a lot of spiritual in it. It had a lot to do with social witness and justice, and it seemed to me that the civil rights movement, which was burgeoning at the time, had a lot of guys who were ministers. And when I turned on the TV at 6 o'clock, there was Jesse Jackson in his overalls and a big afro, and Andy had an equally big afro, and I said, I want to be like those guys. And it wasn't that they were terribly churchy, it was that they were so committed to making the world better and more just. And that fascinated me. And so I think my interest in Christian ministry actually began there. And maybe that was the appropriate beginning because they were trying to demonstrate how we love one another by being socially active and committed, cultural workers in a way. And so my journey began there, and I had very little sense of church and what church people do and what the Bible was. I was not a preacher's kid and not terribly religious, if I would confess to my priest.
Hands all rolled.
You were not headed for the papacy.
I was not headed. In fact, the biggest shock of everyone, including my parents, was I wanted to go to seminary. I mean, where did that come from? So at any rate, the rock and roll musician and going to Motown didn't work out. I had to do something with my life, and I was pretty good at making music, so I got my degrees in music. And then I wasn't satisfied that I wanted to be a professional musician. It still wasn't enough. And so just quite on a lark, I decided to make a trip out east and see what seminary was about, because that's where people learned how to be holy and religious and socially just. and so I went to the divinity school on a lark, and there the birds were chirping on the gates and people were studying, and it was quiet and serene, and I said, oh, this is heaven on earth. And so I just walked in boldly to the admissions office and said, I want to come here. And I don't know anything about what you do, but I need to come here. And by the grace of God, grace, providence, I was accepted in seminary, and that's when my spiritual journey really began. Getting a chance to think about things that I'd never thought about before. And frankly, as a young, aspiring musician, all I did was practice. I practiced and played music, practiced and played music. And it was completely fulfilling, but there was something nagging me kind of in the back of my consciousness that there might be more to this. And so that's when my journey actually, I think, began. And social justice was really the prime factor that got me to seminary. And then I discovered all of this stuff about God and forgiveness and love during those years of study and beginning my ministry. But what was interesting is that when I got to Yale, I couldn't really afford to be there. And so I had to start working in the theater downtown at the Yale Rep, to work my way through seminary. And that's how my connection with Lloyd Richards and Bob Brustein got started, because I was a working journeyman playing in the music pit at the Yale Rep. And it's just through a series of circumstances that I got a chance to work with these wonderful artists and also to continue my own kind of sense of discovery. But the main thing that I think I discovered by being in both worlds, seminary and in the theater world in New Haven, was that that our creative impulse really has a tremendous power. And that what makes theater so powerful when it's true is that it changes us. We come out differently than when we go in. And so I think I discovered that there was something in this art and spirituality, the nexus between the two, as being something that I wanted to further mine and discover. And so really my whole life has been this continuing discovery about all of that. And then it only gets complicated around jazz, because many of the jazz musicians started learning how to play in church. But many of them felt conflicted about being jazz musicians, and many of them ultimately left the church in order to do jazz. So for the past 40 years, I've been trying to bring the two creative worlds together, because I think jazz and spirituality are part of the same impulse. And so I think part of my career has been just trying to explore that and to encourage people to not limit themselves to what's authentic by what we call it. And so that's kind of why we're here today.
Well, thank you. This event started initially closely linked to the Year of Shakespeare, and then as time went on, it expanded beyond that. But we are being hosted by, or supported by the Creativity in the Arts, the David Goldwasser Fund for Religion and the Arts, and by the Hightower Fund, by the English Department, the Rose Library, the Carlos Museum, for an event that really ranges pretty broadly. At the same time, you've, Harry, I mean, I know a number of you have probably seen Julie Taymor's Titus, and if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you go home tonight and watch it. But you've done some other Shakespeare work that has not, Julie's film, which is brilliant, is cast in a particular direction that does not have a social impulse in the same way as some of the other Shakespeare work that you've done. And you could disagree with that. But I'm just thinking about, if you're talking a little bit about your Romeo and Juliet and H4.
Yes, well, I think what Julie's Titus does, she also has a Tempest, as you know,
Yes.
Which we agree about a lot. But Julie's always been very active at casting outside of traditional. So, I mean, arguably, she's cast more black people on Broadway than any other director, just because of The Lion King alone, which she ingeniously realized, and a number of other things. But to your point, it always struck me as ironic that Shakespeare was given to us as this universally truthful, powerful playwright. And yet, every time I see, it, generally speaking, except for now it's changed a little bit, I don't get to see it universally applied. And so under what circumstances could we, who grew up on the south side of Chicago or in Atlanta, when they're looking at Hamlet or looking at any of those stories, how does that engage with me? And the question is, it doesn't most of the time. And when it does, it's rather randomly done. So you just arbitrarily put a black person or a Spanish person or a woman in a male role without any consideration as to how this makes sense to a known and authentic experience. So when we met, when Sheila and I met, we were at this conference. I can't remember, was it Cultural Global Shakespeare? Something like
that, yeah.
Which was a very interesting thing. How do you manifest Shakespeare in non-traditional ways without getting people confused or angry at the fact that you gave no such thought to these kinds of things? Because I get angry about that too. I don't just want to see some black guy rocking up in Taming of the Shrew. It's set in 1660, and yet nobody mentions, what's this brother doing with this, because that wouldn't have happened that way. So it seems to be that when we did that, I was struck by the idea, well, we've never seen it on film. I would direct plays like I did in All Black Julius Caesar, which was set in the Black Power movement, the traditional civil rights movement vis-a-vis the more revolutionary. What happened when SCLC split off from SNCC and the two were irreparably bifurcated, if you will, and what drove that. And so I put Julius Caesar in that construct. It's pretty easily done. People loved it. I did it here in Atlanta at the Drummondie Theater Company in 1992, I want to say. Maybe it was 94. But it's also struck me that since histories are some of the most dramatically rich of those plays, what of those plays speaks to a black experience? And I thought that Henry IV was interesting because here's a father who disapproves of his son, who is hanging out with the wrong type of people, has a responsibility that is greater than his personal, gain and what position he might be held. And that the equivalent of that in Black America really was, the royalty in Black America has traditionally been religious people. Now it's a kind of religio-political person. Now that you've got these people who have become politicians that have no real, like Jesse Jackson, who you mentioned, he has a pedigree with the church, Dr. King, so forth. But from the advent of people like the great Harold Washington, who's my favorite politician ever, he was a purely political animal. Obama, purely political animal. So this is a natural offspring, and I thought that it would be really interesting to do Henry IV from that perspective, because remember, they were actually going off, rather than do this internecine civil war that was happening between the War of the Roses, they call it, the whole Lancaster line versus, that it was ripe for exploration through the black experience. And maybe we can could we show a little bit of, this is a trailer for it, getting the music put on it. The movie should be done in about a month, but this is the trailer for it.
Rob, murder, revel the night, commit the odious sins, the lures kinds of ways. A real man, deep and dangerous.
I speak of Africa.
Years from now, these ancient lords and reverend bishops on the bloody battles with the bruising arms.
The power of Percy is too weak to wage an instant trial against the king.
We may do it as security.
Under which king? Harry Lennix.
Give me the little face me!
That he should throw his several strengths together and come against us in full force.
This offer comes from mercy, not from fear.
The king is weary of dainty and such picking grievances.
To pluck down justice from your awful bench. Thus do the hopes we haven't heard touch ground and dash themselves to pieces.
My name is Harry Percy.
When I will wear a garment all of blood.
The missing my ride who is to bear me like a thunderbolt against the bosom of the Prince of Watts.
The end of life cancels all bonds. I do see danger and disobedience in thine eye. Drive your subjects before you.
Fire rod made in smoky war, all hot and bleeding, will we offer them.
The land is burning. The soil shall daub her lips in her own children's blood. A king's son. Our hands are full of business. Let's away. Uneasy lies the head. Where's the crown? Shall we be married? Shall we have a play? Extempore?
Bear me to that chamber. There I'll lie. That true place of peace shall Harry die.
This is one of those silver lining playbook in this regard. It's taken. This is 6 years old now. This thing. So that's the next movie that I was. But in any case, during that time, Black Lives Matter happened, and I was able to incorporate some of that footage and put it in here because it's a time of unrest. We have reduced the size of the kingdom to Watts, so instead of the Prince of Wales, he's the Prince of Watts, and it's a kind of sub-culture. It's a nation within a nation, as it were. And so we just we took the play, most of the words, changed out a couple of references, and voila.
It was interesting because a few years ago when you sent me the version of the film at that point, my students are often share curricula and things with a group of incarcerated students in Washington State. And when we did Henry IV together and each group saw it, what was interesting is that from the perspective of the incarcerated students, Falstaff is evil. And one of the students said, he said, my Falstaff just died in prison in the Caribbean. And all I can tell you is that I hope that they cremated him and that they sealed the urn, that they welded the urn shut so that he could never influence anybody ever again. And I thought it was really interesting because the typical Emory students and the typical American audiences, that's not how they respond to Falstaff. He's a funny character, he's, you know, outrageous, and people like him. And so it was particularly interesting in that context.
It is interesting, I mean, but you know, obviously Shakespeare's open to interpretation, but I think Falstaff, from the point of view of Henry IV of Bolingbroke, Falstaff is evil. He's a very, very bad influence. He's going to ruin the kingdom because he's badly influenced my son, you know, Henry V. So it's, I agree with him.
Yeah.
He's a funny evil guy, but he's both. You know?
But isn't it exciting to see what I think makes Shakespeare so engaging is that these are stories that can be retold if they are mined for their truth. And so we don't have to see Shakespeare as he was seen 300 years ago, but rather if the artist does their work, then we can see the relevance of these stories about power and greed and mistrust that are human stories that can speak in any time. And what I saw that was so powerful here is, I think what we don't do very well right now is being able to understand the human stories when they don't look like us. Or when they do look like us, we have a different expectation. And you were describing that before, but I don't think we have a community going forward unless we can see the humanity in each other through stories such as this, which is what makes Shakespeare so rich. You know, when you think about Lear's story, you know, all these bad children, everybody knows about having bad kids. And so, so it can be said in a way that you can really understand the humanity of it. And that's what allows art to continue to speak. And it seems to me that's a social justice issue, to not think that all of our stories today have to be told in any one way, but rather that important stories can be told in any number of ways. And I think that's part of the social justice challenge of art today.
I quite agree. You know, I think, in fact, not only can we not it would be impossible for us to see those plays as they were originally conceived because we're living, we're moving, people are moving. So to the kind of museumification, killing it, putting it in its original form, as it were, and placing it as some sort of sacred spot, I think does a great disservice to art. I think that Shakespeare, you know, when in Julius Caesar, for example, he says, when they're standing around Caesar's slaughtered body, somebody says, Cassius, how many ages hence shall this our lofty scene be acted o'er in states unborn, in accents yet unknown? And I think that's permission, admonition, you know, to continuously invest in, reinvent, reconceive, reconfigure these stories. We should do it. That's what he was doing. He stole a lot of those stories. He stole all of them, really. Well, you know, I mean, to a certain extent, you know what I mean? Like we know he didn't conceive of, you know, he didn't pull that right out of the top of his head, Hamlet or Othello or any of the rest. He was appropriated.
So those of you who are here either from Emory or for First Congregational Church are well aware that Dwight Andrews, one of the things that he does regularly is Jazz Vespers, and works very hard at making a direct link. First Congregational also has wonderful concerts and as part of their spiritual mission. And this semester, as I say, he's doing the class on spirituality and jazz, which I said earlier, I said, so you're teaching a whole class just to get ready for tonight? I thought that's really very flattering for all of us. But it's part of a larger project that you're working on, and I wonder if you'd like to talk about what that project is.
Yeah, I think that there is, first of all, a nexus between what Harry just said and the work that I think about as jazz, because jazz, we take a tune. It could be any tune, but it's what you bring to it that makes it jazz. It's your improvisation on a theme. And so when we think about some of the great jazz tunes, we oftentimes are hearing songs that have been remade. If you think about My Favorite Things from Rodgers and Hammerstein, right? And then you think about the way John Coltrane does My Favorite Things. John Coltrane has made it his own and once again spoken with a different accent. But even the wonderful songs like Summertime of Porgy and Bess, I mean, I don't think Gershwin could have ever truly envisioned Miles Davis's version of Summertime, but once you hear it, your life is changed. And that's what jazz does. It says, it takes whatever and pushes it through your own sense of self and possibility, which is what great theater can do. I think you make it your own, and then you find a new way of telling it. So part of my subversive mission, and I do see myself as a very gentle radical, is to reclaim jazz, because jazz is a very peculiar thing in African American culture. You know, it's thought of in some quarters as the devil's music or music of the world and all of these kinds of things. And we understand the complicated heritage of jazz as that. But also at the very same time, it seems to me a great possibility to reclaim the inherent creativity and spirituality of jazz as it was originally. Because in order to do that, you have to critique the way in which race and commodification have pushed jazz into a particular way of understanding that has little to do with its spiritual origins rather. So when we think about the great music of New Orleans, we think about those great songs like When the Saints Go Marching In, when we think about the second line and Mardi Gras. Those were the hymns that the musicians improvised, and they improvised them all the way to the cemetery and all the way back. That's a spiritual expression of the community. And over time, of course, jazz got pardoned off or sectioned off from its spiritual side because of issues of race and power and control and the church. And so what we're simply trying to do at First Congregational Church is we're being radical in reclaiming these expressions which were spiritual to begin with. And because we're trying to do the work, we're trying to say the ways in which we've cordoned ourselves off from ourselves is what we have to, that's a social justice issue. To understand that spirituality has many different prisms. And that's what's exciting about doing that work. And I'm certainly grateful that our church and many other churches are exploring this. John Ginzel in New York had a wonderful ministry to the jazz musicians. And it gave the jazz musicians a chance to express themselves without having to change themselves. And so we're just trying to kind of create a sense of possibility and welcome for this music in the church. And so far, well, I still have my job, so that's a good thing. And so we're doing it.
You've got a job and a job to spare.
That's right.
Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that. You know, we were talking a little bit earlier about LeRoy Jones's Blues People and his essential argument that it was not until the confrontation with the West, the black people in their United States lives, separated the sacred and the
secular.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. With regard to the jazz aspect of it, largely, let's just say that, you know, in the early 20th century, was it not rather more the church insisting that its music not be used in popular music? Or was it really the musicians themselves leaving their sacred background? Right. Which one would you say was more weighty?
From my perspective, it has much more to do with the church and the church's effort to control worship and understanding of worship and music, and it has to do with hymnals, it has to do with proper theological practice. There's some wonderful missionary notes in the during slavery times when Methodists and Baptists were converting slaves to Christianity, and they said, we keep trying to teach the slaves how to sing the hymns, but they keep wanting to clap, and they keep wanting to dance, and they keep wanting to shout, and they don't sing the intervals quite right. They like to bend the tones, and and all of a sudden I said, yeah, this is the black experience that I know, because Leroy Jones properly said that one of the African proverbs was that the Spirit does not descend without a song. So you can't have the Spirit without the music. And so he understood that. But I think the church, as it tried to become proper, as it tried to become more white, as it tried to find an acceptance for the new Negroes and not the old Negroes, there was a kind of pushing jazz outside as much as the musicians. I don't think the musicians took themselves outside. I think that's where they found a place of welcome and a place of work. But we have to all acknowledge that part of the challenge between spirituality and religion is that religion has to do with rules and practices and control. And in the black church experience, and for many of us, that control has meant that jazz was not a proper controllable kind of expression, because people improvise. I mean, so, if they start improvising, then what happens? And so because of those basic tensions and the realities that the hymnal becomes the kind of main hymn book for worship, there's a tension there between what jazz is and where the religious authorities wanted it to be. There was a Catholic edict sometime around 1903 where people were starting to take more license with worship, and so they were concerned about jazz creeping in, and so they said specifically, no jazz instruments, no drums, any idea that jazz might be creeping in was absolutely forbidden. And so jazz didn't become an accepted part of Catholic practice until Vatican II, so that was what, 1962 or 60, yeah, in the 60s. So as the church sought to kind of amend its rules to make sure that people were there to worship, it opened up, in a sense, religious practice around styles. And jazz finally came into being, which incidentally, that's when Duke Ellington and Dave Brubeck started to work within those large
sacred, so-called sacred music.
Yeah.
So this seems like a nice segue to the project that you're working on now.
I think that's true. That's good catch, Sheila. Good catch. So we were talking earlier about, I think we mentioned it, but as a seminarian, I was always struck by John. It's the second shortest of the Gospels. It's considered supplemental as opposed to synoptic. And I think it has a lot sort of more, to me, it's a lot more sort of mysterious, whereas Matthew goes through some trouble to make sure that all of the items are checked off the list, giving Jesus his rights to legitimacy. And Luke is concerned with, bringing it to a Greek audience for Gentiles and so forth. John is something in between, and I thought it was the perfect catch for the black experience. By examining the Gospel of John through gospel music and through what we might call spirituals and through modern gospel music, it seemed, once again, one of those things that should have been thought of a long time ago. So this is a trailer to it. We hope to have it done and out this year, this calendar year. If it doesn't, maybe we can do something early next year with it. But this has been an extraordinary labor of love. I've spent all of my money and then some on this because I couldn't get people to bite. But I think that the people will bite. But we'll see. I'll get an example. We'll do a taste test after this. It's called Revival, by the way.
This man has committed no crime.
You equate yourself with God.
Do you believe in the Father?
Yes, Lord.
What would you have us do with this man, Jesus?
Father, let this cup pass from me. Let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Not my will,
Wow. You bad, Harry. You bad.
I hope you like the way.
Oh, my gosh.
So that's, we shot, the movie shot. We are deep in post-production on it. I just got my saxophone player. We've got Terry Lewis working on the music from Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis with the time and all that. So we got a bunch of actors, as you see in it, and we think that this can be the first of many such offerings, which we've been discussing. But I think that there's no time like right now, and I'm glad it didn't come out before, because I think its impact and its potential for good is richer now than ever. People are uneasy, they're unsettled. I think they should have been unsettled a long time ago, and that we slept on a lot of what is happening now and lost the moral high ground, as it were, to bring up a lot of these issues around social justice. We were talking earlier, Black Lives Matter started under Barack Obama, and nothing was done. And lip service was done. And we were talking earlier, this might be a little controversial, but I was pleased that Donald Trump at least said something interesting during his inauguration. He mentioned Chicago and what's happening there. That was never done by Obama. So I'm hoping that even if people don't, share my relief, at least in him mentioning that. I did not vote for Donald Trump, nor would I today. I almost lost my life campaigning for Senator Clinton. I was in a car accident. We were hit at 50 miles an hour on September 25th. Should not have walked out of that. Nobody but Jesus got me out of that. And I'm saying that the time is now. We can do something, and we can actually just hold him accountable to what he said. Didn't he mention Chicago? See? So he said he's going to send in the feds. 780 people last year got slaughtered in Chicago. Nobody said anything about it because they were so tied into their sense of racial loyalty, whatever it was, that we slept on the job, and them brothers got shot like pigs in the street, and nothing happened to none of them. Them cops that slaughtered them people. That's unforgivable. To me, I'm glad that I made a Jesus movie because I can maybe learn something about forgiveness, but I don't forgive that. That's not cool to me. So anyway, I'm done with it. But
no, amen. I hear you. So part of what Harry's passion points to is, I think, the potential to really be a response to the current confusion in our world. And I do think we need to hold ourselves accountable.
That's true.
And so part of the self-critique of the church is our failure to speak. And we were so quiet for so long. This moment was only possible because we were silent for too long.
That's right.
And we lost the moral compass and the moral high ground, creating big churches and big preachers and big helipads. And we lost the sense of purpose. Social justice comes out of our moral commitment to love, which is a religious, it's a spiritual, it's what Jesus taught. But I think that we have too lost our bearings and have looked too much inward to our own self-preservation and in a sense failed to continue the movement, which still has work to do.
Let me ask you a question, just to follow up on that, just real quick. We were talking earlier about, to some extent, where this Black Lives Matter movement is and how it is almost deliberately anti-God in some sense, or at least absent of that spiritual aspect. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's part of a larger cultural movement that is the way in which, and it's generational, but it's not just generational. There was an article, I think, in the Atlantic Monthly not too long ago that talked about the ways in which younger generation, not just millennials and young adults, but the ways in which they do not have the institutional connections to have a tether around morality and something outside of themselves. So for that reason, Black Lives Matter is a community based on the goal of Black Lives Matter, as opposed to a spiritual and social justice consciousness. And that's a part of a time when many of our young people don't have any institutional connections. I'm not just trying to make you go to church. I'm just saying that as you fracture your communities so that people are only tethered to either their experience or their sense of entitlement
or identity,
then this kind of identity politics is not deep enough to hold you through the kinds of tumultuous times that we have. So Black Lives Matter was really a difficult moment in Atlanta, because you had the older generation of civil rights activists trying to talk to the young people who had no sense of the history of the civil rights movement. They discovered racism. And so all of a sudden, you know, we need to protest. And if the old heads in Atlanta were going, we've been fighting this for 100 years. Where have you been? Right. But because we have not been connected with this new constituency, my students, I have to teach spirituality and religion in my class because very few of them consider themselves religiously affiliated. It's not a criticism, but it just means that people like Jesus have absolutely no meaning. Allah, no meaning. The Holy Spirit, no meaning. And so they think about hugging a tree as a kind of nice thing to do, but it's not tied to something greater. And I do think that this is one of the threats to our sense of community in the entire world right now. Everything is becoming identity politics and driven inward rather than outward. And I think that this kind of work that we are doing is really what we're called to in this present moment, which you have to be creative. What you're doing on film is a creative way to tell the story, to re-engage a community that is socially media-driven, not one-to-one driven.
There's this idea, I'm sorry, there's a concept in my research on theological aesthetics. For example, I came across, I can't remember her name just now, but she studied at Trinity College, and all this Irish woman, I can't remember. But, as you are an Irish. But there's this idea of locus theologicus, something that is a substitute, as it were, for religion. Something like art might be a way, an apt surrogate for religion, or identity politics might be in locus theologicus. And I think that we find ourselves in this particular time not having, and again, we're not, I don't think we're proselytizing here, trying to win souls to the kingdom. If it happens, so be it. But our main point here is talking about the intersection that we find in our work. But I do think that that it is frequently a poor substitute because it doesn't have any longevity. It doesn't. It ends with the self, which is among those things that Baraka was talking about. So anyway,
I think it's a good point.
No, I was just going to open things up and see if there were questions or comments. Yes. If you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
I go by OT. I live here in Atlanta. I've lived here for many years. And thank you for hosting this forum. I'm looking forward to the panel introduction today. Amazing.
Yeah.
But I have a question. As a person who has, I'm not multi-generational, but I have a lot of interaction with younger people who are young enough to be my kids. And one of the things that I've noticed is, to your point about there doesn't seem to be a connection between faith and like movements like Black Lives Matter. But what I see as someone who is 40 plus is that the faith community, to me, the silence about what's going on now is deafening.
yes, sir.
It is amazing. And then I see people like this minister who is, you know, Donald Trump is his new bestie. It's like, can you explain this to me? Because if nothing other than his condemnation of the Central Park Five, who have been cleared by DNA and an admission of a guy who did it, you're still supporting this man? My question is, why do you think this is happening? Because now it's like, it's all about, I gotta have a jet, I gotta have a big church, architecture as the biggest car and those things, as opposed to dealing with the social injustice issues?
So my short answer is, and this is certainly not a new problem. I mean, people like Du Bois really doubted the possibilities of the black church as being true to social justice because it was thinking of itself. And so this is a long-standing debate. But for me, the present situation is really built around the church's failure, its silence. And its silence has to do with its inability to critique itself. And this is not a new conversation, but the church has not stayed on the edge. And in a sense, the irony of this, of the civil rights movement, is the success of the civil rights movement, right? So people really, we desegregated, in quotation marks, the schools. We got some of us into major universities and teaching positions at major universities. And the church never really repositioned the next set of goals. And so the civil rights movement grew out of a moral social justice issue. And it's had certain issues like desegregation and equal access and, human rights, etc. But the church never really repositioned itself because in some ways it got bought off by the success of desegregation and the rest. And so in our affluence, and I certainly think that's been a problem, faith and affluence, we haven't articulated how those two things go together. And so now I have great middle-class members who are trying to figure out how do you lead a purposeful, faithful life and live in a gated community. And who is my community? And so I think the church, and that's why it's exciting to do the work that we're trying to do, because I think if we don't have that conversation, if it's not a faith stance, then all of the other things will not bear the weight of the challenge of social justice in the world today. So the church has failed. I take the responsibility for my little part of that world. But by the same token, that's why we preach every Sunday, right? So that we can try to, get back up on it.
I think also I'm sorry, yeah, he speaks for me.
Question back there.
May I speak wrong tonight, Mrs. Clerk? What other eras or stories or personalities might you want to build some entertainment notions around? Shakespeare's, that's marvelous, what you're doing with Jesus, that's fantastic. But are there some others that you might look at that might be ways of engaging culture?
Absolutely. I think that, thank you for your question. I think that at least, and I'm sure Dwight has his own answers to these issues as well. We've actually started talking about, he's got some great ideas and I want to help him, or at least be associated. I'm not, can't help anybody. Try to help myself here. But put the mask on yourself first before I. So just a quick list of the next thing we want to do, a King Solomon story. We want to do a David story. I've already commissioned a Book of Ruth story, which is set in the American Dust Bowl, which would be very interesting, where they're going back to someplace, like maybe they go to California and it is the equivalent of, well, you know the story perfectly well. They go back to Bethlehem, Judah, and of course, bad things, or they go back to Moab. Where do they go? They go to someplace and they marry some Moabite women and God kills them all, and so forth. So anyway, we want to do a lot of those stories, but apply them to known situations. Like I said, I think one of the confounding things and what turns off a lot of people is when we just willy-nilly put some black people in a known thing, like the Black Honeymooners or something. That's a whole different experience. Come on, man. We have to be able to authentically apply these universal stories because they are universal, and it's not that difficult to do. Just think about it a little bit. So anyway, those are among the things, and then there's some things that are not even biblically associated, which we consider faith, because that's what it should be. I mean, if you look at something like A Raisin in the Sun and these things, God is discussed. She slaps her daughter when the daughter says, God, there is no blasted God. Right. She said, in my mother's house, there's that's a deeply spiritual movie at play. So I think that true black culture, true black entertainment cannot be divorced from it. Because when we try to do that, we go off the, to me, we go off the rails.
What do you anticipate might be the reaction of the traditional church community to these remaking of things such as the gospel and the things that, do you anticipate opposition?
I hope so. I hope we get opposition. Because, you know, honestly, we're you know, when things start getting, when you follow the heat, do you know what I mean? That's where the real progress is. We used to say in Chicago, we don't run from a fight, we run to a fight. So, but I hope that there's opposition because it will tell me that we're on to something.
That at least they're listening.
That they're listening, that they're outraged by it, that they're provoked. We were talking about being a provocateur and an agitator. These are not negatives in our view. It's time to shake things up a little bit spiritually, because I think we are in a morass that needs to be agitated greatly, particularly in this field of endeavor. So.
Speak to the church. I'm John Ed, friend of White's, but the church is not monolithic. And when you say that, in some cases you say that, well, the church abandoned this, then there's another church, another aspect of the church that took this whole thing on in a different direction. And they feel, how you say, they feel that they're vindicated because they squashed some other aspect of another religiosity, or how you might want to call it. And at the same time, spirituality runs the gamut in terms of the spectrum. On that, there's an evil spirit, if you will, and then there's the other spirit that you might call good on that side. So when you're running the church and you've got these church things going on, then you've got one set of churches over here that says, well, we shouldn't be dealing with that aspect of Black Lives Matter, if you will, and those other kinds of things. So I don't think the church is all that united within the context of either spirituality, as you might define it, or even religion, because then you've got, as my pastor always said, you've got all of these faith traditions within Christianity, these how you say, denominations. And so we're divided up even in the context of Christianity. And then if you're looking at Islam, and you've got the battle going on over there between that faith tradition. And so we're unsettled, as you mentioned. So how do you settle that within the context of who's right and who's wrong?
Well, let me start because who's right and who's wrong is not one of the questions that I ask myself, and it's really for this reason. The reason we have so many denominations is because all of these different denominations have said that we are right and they're wrong, and so I get that. But the irony of this whole conversation is, I think if Jesus had been successful, he would not have advocated for a church, right? He would have advocated that people love one another and forgive one another and help one another. And so the irony of the church, and this is the tension, Johnny, that all churches have to deal with, is if we were really good at what we do as a church, there would be no church. And the problem, as we've seen in the present body politic, is it's hard to get rid of the things that you are really invested in. And so, you know, I think that once the church gets invested in itself, it gets harder to give full duty to loving one another and helping one another and respecting one another in our difference. I mean, Jesus was not terribly complicated in his teachings. But the irony is that the history of the Christian religion is very complicated because we've made a whole complicated set of rules to explain what Jesus said. And I think I basically got what Jesus said the first time. I mean, I think he said, like, love one another, right? And don't judge. Let God do the judging. and live fully and freely and happily. And so our work, I think, is just to try to reconnect to that. Jesus's, I think, teachings were intensely spiritual and not terribly religious. His whole point to the temple was, hey, you guys are paying too much attention to the law, and you're not loving one another. And so when you go through all of Jesus' writings, what does he say? He said, you know, when you pray, pray in private. Don't pray so that everybody knows you're praying, you know. And so this kind of hypocrisy that Jesus preached against, I think, is what is our struggle, to just try to stay true to our cause. We have the church now. It's not going to go away, but I think that churches, if they are genuine, will continue to live toward the love and not toward themselves. If that makes sense.
So we're about to wrap up, so I'm going to give you the last word if you'd like it.
I'd be happy to take a question.
Okay.
I don't know about the, I feel like Lawrence O'Donnell if I take the last one. Good question.
Mm-hmm.
So what I see in the black community is the forefront of the problem of the world, and that's a breakdown in moral values. What we have is a destruction of families with blacks. I was very fortunate. I was brought up with a man who took me out to the community, and I got to see loving black families. But what I see and I hear, I don't know, is that we have a high rate of young black men incarcerated.
Yep.
A high rate of young black men without jobs.
Yep.
And what that leads to is the breakdown in the family. Because in Scripture it teaches that a man is to love his wife and a wife is to respect her husband. And as long as we have men that are in a position where they're not respected, we're going to have this breakdown in society. So I welcome you in the black community to try to figure out the way to turn this around. And we can turn to you for direction.
So let me just ask a question. I want to make sure I understand your point. Is it your sense that the black community is more representative of this family breakdown than the white community?
Exactly.
And why do you say that?
Because of what I said about young black men not having jobs. How can you have a wife if you don't have a job?
Okay, now I understand. So as I take my medication, do you want to answer this first? Seriously though.
No, yeah,
so
please.
here's a classic problem. Here's a classic problem of the myth being made into the reality. The myth of whatever struggles there are within the black families is also very prevalent in the white community. That's the first thing. But to not understand why there are particular types of dysfunction in the black community without understanding the way in which this society is structured to keep black people in a particular place in this society is to completely misunderstand the interpretation of what it means. And first of all, I don't accept the idea that the statistics are any more dramatic in the black community than the white community. I do think that they are interpreted in such a way so that we presume that when you live in the inner city, it means X, Y, and Z. When you live in the suburbs, it means X, Y, and Z. But I think that part of our challenge is really to not begin with the myth, which drives too much of social policy. It drives everything with our justice system. It has everything to do with having money and not having money, and the ways in which our largest society keeps black people in a position very similar to where they were 100 years ago, completely by intention. So when we look at the failure of education in America, that's by design, not by accident. When you look at the losing of the tax base for public education, then you understand the destruction, the total design destruction of the black community with great intention and great skill.
Mass incarceration, the privatization of prisons,
Absolutely.
the unfair prison sentencing. All of these things were by design. That said, you know, I don't know that we can expect much hope from anyone outside of the community because very little has come. So we are besieged by certain, because it was Benjamin Disraeli who said that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. But among the statistics are the fact that black men, in spite of all of these troubles, and in spite of the fact that jobs and property and all of these things were systematically denied or taken away, spend more time with their children than any other demographic of people. It is not true that fathers are as absent as it is widely purported. So I think that, you know, I hear what you're saying. I hear the empathy that you have for the black community. I appreciate that. I hear what Brother Andrews is saying as well, which is that there's a bigger story here and a deeper history. But I think more than so is we can keep defining the problem and trying to diagnose the problem. But at a certain point, we need to come up with solutions.
Absolutely.
And our solution is through the application of our craft and our faith and putting it out there for the people to consume. So that's
well said.
Right.
No, and I think that that's a wonderful wrap up to everything we've been talking about. The one thing I would like to add is, as a longtime faculty member at Emory and as the parent of a college student, that my experience of the younger generation is that their minds are not in fact empty, but that they are some of the smartest, most thoughtful, most incredible. I think we've got an extraordinary group of young people coming up through the ranks, and that there's a lot to be done. But
Young persons ask a question. Can we give voice to a younger generation? Because he's held his hand up.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Jackson.
My name is Jackson. I'm her grandson. And I have a question for Mr. Lennix about your faith journey.
Yes.
You grew up black and light-skinned and a Catholic in your youth. And I'm at a Jesuit Catholic school right now in Atlanta, Christopher Jesuit High School. And I wanted to ask you, do you think it's possible to be black and have a black religious experience, as you said, at a Catholic church? Do you think that's at all possible?
Great question.
That's a great question. And in fact, my first advice is you go immediately to a Dominican school. No, I'm just I'm kidding. Okay. It's all love. It's all love, kid. No, so, but I know it's possible because you know I have a very good friend, happens to be a white priest, but his name is Father Mike Flager, and he's got an all-black congregation, and they rock the party. I mean, it is as black a church experience as a Pentecostal, you know, a church. So, and then there are others, of course. There Father George Clemens when he was in Chicago. It was a little more formal. But the praise experience, the worship experience at St. Sabina, where, you know, I've known Father Mike since I'm 13 years old. He grew up in that community. He's a blue-eyed soul brother, if there ever was one. He's the modern-day equivalent of John Brown. But I know that and then there are places in L.A. Where they have, you know, pretty close. But in terms of the authenticity, what we would consider an authentic black church experience, just as Brother Johnny Edwards was just saying, it's not monolithic, right? So you've got the AME church experience, which is pretty formal, and I enjoy it. Richard Allen's church. You got the Baptist experience, where my mama grew up in. She converted to Catholicism. But now you've got, I think, so what that is pretty fluid, but I would say if you're looking for a kind of just a funky good time at church, you can be black and have that. I don't know about here, but I know in Chicago I can send you someplace.
Well,
Yeah.
I just want to thank you both. You know, this has just been fabulous, and I'm thrilled to have you here. Yes, and please join me in thanking them.
Great,
Great service.
And lots to think about and lots of wonderful artistic things to come. So thank you all for joining us this evening.
Yeah.
Preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.